12 days, one ship, 60 nautical miles off the Cuban coast. No press release, no official statement, no congressional notification. The USS Bataan, a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship carrying the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit and roughly 1,900 Marines, held station south of Cienfuegos Harbor and launched MV-22 Osprey sorties twice a day, like a man checking his watch. The question the Politico Cuba contingency reporting raised, and then left unanswered, was not whether Bataan was preparing a landing. It was not. The question was who, exactly, was supposed to notice. On the radar scope, a single return pulses at the edge of the sweep, and every decision that follows flows from that contact. Cienfuegos is not a random coordinate on Cuba's southern coast. It is the deepest natural harbor on the island, roughly 250 kilometers southeast of Havana, wide enough and deep enough to berth warships that cannot fit anywhere else on the Cuban coastline. Soviet nuclear submarines used it during the Cold War. Russian surface combatants have used it since. In July 2026, a Staroguzhsky-class Russian corvette was finishing a port call there while a Chinese signals intelligence ship transited the Windward Passage, the 80-kilometer strait between Haiti and Cuba connecting the Atlantic to the Caribbean. 3 events, 1 narrow geography, and a Wasp-class amphib with its well deck flooded, parked inside Osprey range of the harbor entrance, watching all of it. What most observers read as a show of force was actually something more precise, and the real audience was not Havana. But what Bataan was doing in those 12 days shows up on screen as a sequence of concrete actions. F-35Bs cycling off the flight deck, MH-60 Seahawks dropping sonar buoys, the carrier island superstructure lit up through a night vision lens as the task group held position south of Cuba. Read those images the way a war college analyst reads them, not as preparation for an attack, but as a demonstration that the preferred routes into the Florida Strait run directly through a carrier defense screen that can be closed in hours. That is what the Second Fleet put on the water in July 2026, and it is something the U.S. military has not attempted in this hemisphere since the Soviet Union collapsed. Start with the ocean itself, because the ocean does not move. The open water horizon south of Cuba is the same water a Soviet submarine threaded in 1962, and the patrol routes the Gerald R. Ford's aircraft are flying today follow the same geometry for the same reason. Cuba sits 90 miles from Key West. That is not a metaphor, it is a nautical measurement that defines the southern approach to the Gulf of Mexico, the eastern entry to the Yucatan Channel, and the western boundary of the Windward Passage. Any naval force operating from Cuban ports on the island's southern coast can reach the Windward Passage in under 24 hours at standard transit speeds. Any force with access to Cienfuegos specifically can reach the open Caribbean without transiting the busy and observed Florida Strait at all. The southern coast is, from a strategic basing standpoint, a backdoor that the United States spent decades assuming was closed. That assumption held through the 1990s and into the 2000s because neither Russia nor China had the force projection capability or the diplomatic access to make it relevant. The calculus began shifting around 2017. It shifted faster between 2022 and 2025, as Russian naval vessels resumed regular port calls to Havana and Cienfuegos, as Chinese investment in Caribbean port infrastructure accelerated, and as several Caribbean states began weighing infrastructure deals with Chinese state-owned entities that, in a handful of other theaters, translated from commercial investment to dual-use access arrangements. The Pentagon watched this not with alarm, exactly, but with the focused attention of an institution that has learned to read port dredging contracts the way a cardiologist reads an EKG. If you want the analysis behind the deployment rather than just the deployment, this channel is where the map gets decoded. Subscribe now. The specific asset matters. Bataan is not a carrier strike group. She is an amphibious assault ship, 257 meters of flight deck and well deck, capable of launching F-35B fighters vertically, operating MV-22 Ospreys at ranges up to 900 kilometers, and placing Marines on a beach without a pier. The 22nd MEU she was carrying trains for exactly this kind of forced entry or permissive entry operation. But framing Bataan's presence as a landing threat misreads the geometry. A single LHD does not conduct a contested amphibious assault against a defended coastline without a much larger naval force. The Pentagon knows this. The Russian naval attaché in Havana knows this. This signal was not "we will land Marines." The signal was something more calibrated and in some ways more unsettling to an adversary planning a long-term basing arrangement. The signal was, "we can watch you from here indefinitely." Spend a moment with what the MV-22 sorties actually accomplished because this is the detail that most reporting on the deployment skipped entirely. The Osprey has a combat radius depending on load of roughly 700 to 900 kilometers. Launched from a ship holding station 60 nautical miles south of Cienfuegos Harbor, an MV-22 can reach the harbor entrance in under 10 minutes. It can photograph, surveil, and characterize every vessel in the anchorage and be back aboard Bataan before the harbor pilot finishes his paperwork. 2 sorties per day, every day, for 12 days, means that every movement of that Cienfuegos-class corvette, every resupply boat, every personnel transfer, every fuel barge approach and departure, was observed at close range by American airframes operating from international waters, not overhead satellites with their orbital mechanics and predictable windows, manned aircraft on demand, at whatever time the watch officer on Bataan chose. The imagery collected during those sorties, the high-resolution characterization of hull modifications, antenna configurations, and crew activity patterns, was the kind of persistent intelligence product that no satellite constellation can replicate. What stands out is the openness of it. The U.S. Navy made no effort to disguise the sorties. The AIS transponder gap that preceded Bataan's arrival in the operating area, noted by several maritime tracking platforms, ended once she took station. She was visible. She was trackable. She wanted to be found, because being found was the point. Here is the strategic logic. If you are a Russian naval planner evaluating the long-term viability of Cienfuegos as a sustained basing node rather than an occasional port call, the presence of an American Amphib 60 miles off the harbor entrance for nearly 2 weeks changes the calculation in ways that a diplomatic protest or a satellite pass does not. A protest is paper. A satellite has a schedule. An LHD with Ospreys is a persistent surveillance platform that can be replaced by another LHD, and then another, indefinitely. The question for Russian naval planning becomes not can we use Cienfuegos, but can we use Cienfuegos without the Americans watching every movement in real time from international waters? The answer, demonstrated empirically over 12 days, is no. 1 Amphib. 12 days. The access problem shifts from a political question to a geometric one. Dig into the history and the trajectory becomes clearer. Soviet engagement with Cuba peaked in the 1960s and 1970s and formally ended with an agreement in 1979 that prohibited Soviet nuclear submarines from operating out of Cuban ports. That agreement held, largely, through the end of the Cold War. Russian re-engagement with the island began tentatively in the 2000s, accelerated under economic pressure in the 2010s, and took on a different character after 2020. Russian naval vessels, including frigates and submarines, made at least 4 publicized port calls to Havana between 2022 and mid-2026. The Havana calls were conspicuous by design. Warships at a pier visible from the Malecón, photographs shared by Cuban state media, statements about routine bilateral naval cooperation. The Cienfuegos port calls arrived without the helicopters, without the deck operations, without the arrested landings that announce a carrier's presence from 50 miles out. A frigate ties up at a pier and the radar stays dark. That silence is the distinction that matters. The Havana visits were theater, the Cienfuegos calls were logistics. Logistical access to a deep southern harbor, if regularized and expanded, represents something the Russian Navy has not had in the Western Hemisphere at scale since 1991. The geometry of that access, if it became reliable, would force the U.S. Navy to reroute Caribbean patrol patterns, reconsider the surface combatant posture of the Fourth Fleet, and potentially reactivate naval presence infrastructure in the region that has been on minimal staffing for 30 years. The Pentagon decided it was cheaper to park an Amphib off the harbor entrance for 12 days than to have that conversation formally. During the 3rd day of Bataan's deployment, according to a former naval intelligence officer who reviewed the unclassified summary of the operation, the watch team aboard the ship observed an unusual pattern of small boat traffic in and out of Cienfuegos harbor. A series of rigid-hull inflatable boats made multiple transits between the corvette and a pier on the harbor's northern arm, carrying what imagery analysis later characterized as equipment cases consistent with signals intelligence hardware. The activity lasted approximately 4 hours and was logged in its entirety. It was not the activity of a ship preparing to depart, it was the activity of a ship receiving something. What the Ospreys captured that afternoon was a transfer that Russian naval planners almost certainly assumed would go unobserved, because no adversary had ever maintained persistent manned surveillance of that harbor at that operational tempo before. The fact that it did not go unobserved is precisely the kind of detail that changes long-range planning assumptions at the institutional level. The Chinese SIGINT vessel transit through the Windward Passage during the same window was, on one level, coincidental. SIGINT ships transit international waterways. That is what they are designed to do. But the specific timing, the Windward Passage corridor during an active Russian port call to Cienfuegos with an American Amphib holding station to the south, created a surveillance geometry that planners on all 3 sides were aware of and logging. The Chinese vessel was characterizing the electromagnetic environment of the operating area, Bataan's radar emissions, Osprey communications, any passive sonar buoys that the accompanying surface screen might have deployed. This is routine intelligence collection, and it is precisely the kind of routine collection that, repeated over months and years, builds a targeting picture of how the U.S. operates its amphibious ready groups in a contested Caribbean environment. The fact that it happened in full view of Bataan was not a coincidence. It was a data exchange. The U.S. was demonstrating its persistent surveillance capability. China was demonstrating its intent to understand that capability. Both sides logged the encounter without a single hostile act, because the whole exchange was operating in the grammar of deterrence, not the grammar of conflict. Here is an assessment that may generate some pushback. The U.S. response to Russian and Chinese Caribbean outreach has been consistently under-resourced, and the Bataan deployment, significant as it was, represents a course correction that arrived roughly 4 years later than the threat picture warranted. The Fourth Fleet, headquartered in Mayport, Florida, operates with a fraction of the surface combatant presence that the Pacific and European theaters command. The Atlantic and Caribbean have been treated for the better part of 2 decades as a strategic backwater, while the Indo-Pacific pivot consumed the bulk of force structure planning bandwidth. If a single corvette port called a Cienfuegos and a SIGINT transit through the Windward Passage can prompt a 12-day Amphib deployment, that suggests the threshold for response has been calibrated too reactively. We'll say what most won't. The Fourth Fleet's Caribbean posture has been diplomatically optimistic in a period that did not warrant optimism. Now the second layer. The one the initial reporting did not reach. Bataan's presence was not only about Cienfuegos. It was about every Caribbean state currently evaluating a Chinese port infrastructure proposal. There are at least 7 such proposals in various stages of negotiation across the Caribbean basin as of mid-2026, ranging from container terminal expansions in Jamaica and Trinidad to a deep-water berthing facility study in Guyana. The common thread is Chinese state financing through institutions connected to the People's Liberation Army Navy's Logistics Modernization Program, the same program that produced Djibouti and Hambantota and Gwadar. None of those Caribbean investments have crossed the threshold of dual-use military access, yet. But the trajectory of Chinese port investment globally suggests that commercial and dual use exist on a continuum whose endpoint is negotiated after the concrete is poured. Every Caribbean Minister of Trade and Infrastructure who read the Politico reporting on Bataan's positioning understood the subtext. American amphibious ready groups can hold station off any island in this region inside Osprey range of any port. Chinese port infrastructure, once built, would be visible to American surveillance assets operating from international waters within hours of any anomalous vessel traffic. The geography of the Caribbean basin, which puts no island more than a few hundred kilometers from an amphib operating in the Florida Strait or the Windward Passage, is a structural American advantage that does not require a carrier strike group to exercise. A WASP-class LHD with a Marine Expeditionary Unit does the job at a fraction of the cost. I spent considerable time going through the open-source maritime tracking data from that 12-day window, and one detail kept nagging at the picture: the well deck. Bataan kept her well deck flooded throughout the deployment. That is not a standard surveillance posture. A well deck is flooded for one purpose: to launch or recover landing craft. Keeping it flooded for 12 consecutive days is a maintenance decision that costs fuel and crew hours, and it signals readiness for an amphibious operation that everyone on the ship and everyone watching the ship knows is not being planned. It is a signal in the grammar of capability demonstration. We are prepared, we are capable, and we are choosing not to act. That choice is the deterrent, not the Marines, not the Ospreys. The visible, sustained, deliberate readiness that is not exercised. That is the most sophisticated form of military signaling. It requires the audience to understand what you could do and why you have decided not to do it yet. Consider briefly the men and women aboard Bataan during those 12 days, because the human dimension of a deployment like this is rarely examined and it matters. The 22nd MEU had loaded out of Norfolk expecting a standard deployment cycle. What they executed was something different: 12 days of sustained observation operations with no clear endpoint communicated to the junior ranks, in a threat environment that was ambiguous by design. The watch schedule was maintained at wartime tempo. The Osprey crews flew every sortie knowing the airspace over Cienfuegos harbor, while International was being observed and characterized by the same Chinese vessel they could see on the surface picture. The Marines on the well deck, running drills against the possibility that the flooded deck might actually be used, did their jobs without being told whether the exercise was still an exercise. That sustained operational ambiguity, held for nearly 2 weeks, requires a disciplined and proficient force. The 22nd MEU delivered it. That institutional capacity, as much as any hardware or geometry, is what the deployment demonstrated. Russian planners now stare at the same sonar display screen their counterparts have studied for decades, except the contacts on it are no longer theoretical. An Ohio-class submarine is somewhere in those returns, and a Type O-52D destroyer skipper has to calculate whether his hull can localize it before the Seahawks already airborne do it for him. A Cienfuegos-class corvette is a capable littoral combatant, roughly 2,200 tons, armed with calibre cruise missiles and a respectable air defense suite for a vessel of its displacement. In the context of a Caribbean port call, it is a diplomatic instrument, not a combat-credible force in the face of an American amphib with a Marine Expeditionary Unit embarked and a surface screen that the available reporting suggests included at least one Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. The corvette's presence in Cienfuegos during the Bataan window was noted, catalogued, and photographed by American airframes. Its departure was equally observed.
Every hour of its port call, from arrival to the moment its lines were cast off, exists in an American intelligence record that will inform planning assumptions about Russian Caribbean operations for years.
The operational lesson for Russian naval planning is geometrically uncomfortable. To use Cienfuegos as anything more than an infrequent port call, Russia would need to establish a sustained naval presence in the Caribbean capable of contesting American surveillance of the harbor. That requires surface combatants, potentially submarines, and a logistics chain across the Atlantic that the Russian Navy's current force structure cannot sustain simultaneously with its Baltic, Black Sea, and Northern Fleet commitments. The force structure math does not work. And the U.S. Navy's demonstrated willingness to park an amphib off the harbor entrance for 12 days suggests that any Russian attempt to establish a more robust Caribbean footprint would be met with proportionally more capable American presence, not proportionally more capable diplomatic language. The rival's countermove, in other words, is prohibitively expensive. That is what deterrence looks like when it is working. For China, the calculus is different in longer term. Chinese naval expansion in the Caribbean is not about forward-basing combat power in the near term. It is about establishing the infrastructure, relationships, and access agreements that would give China options in a future crisis, particularly one involving Taiwan or the South China Sea, where American attention and force structure would be intensely focused in the Pacific. A Chinese naval facility in Cuba, or Jamaica, or Guyana does not threaten American dominance of the Caribbean today. It threatens the assumption of American dominance in a decade's time, when China's blue water navy is larger, its logistics chain is more developed, and its diplomatic relationships in the Caribbean basin are deeper. The Bataan deployment was a message to that future China as much as to the current one. The U.S. is paying attention now, before the concrete is poured, and the geography of this region works against you in ways that a decade of investment will not fully overcome. What do you think? Is a 12-day amphib deployment the right instrument for that kind of long-range deterrent messaging, or does it require something more sustained? The comments will be open on that. Pull back to the strategic picture. Because the Bataan deployment is one data point in a pattern that has been building since the Second Fleet was reactivated in 2018 after a nearly quarter-century hiatus. The Second Fleet's reactivation was itself a signal. The Atlantic is no longer a settled strategic space. The North Atlantic approaches, the Caribbean basin, and the Windward and Leeward passages are contested geography again in a way they have not been since the late 1980s. The institutional memory for how to operate in that environment, how to sustain a Caribbean deterrent posture, how to use amphibious-ready groups as persistent surveillance and signaling platforms rather than assault forces, had to be rebuilt from partial documentation and the recollections of officers whose relevant experience dated to the Bush administration. Bataan's 12 days off Cienfuegos was the Second Fleet demonstrating to itself as much as to Moscow and Beijing that it remembers how to do this. One detail that stuck with me in the Politico reporting was a single line noting that the 22nd MEU's Norfolk loadout, completed several days before Bataan's AIS gap began, included a configuration that a former Marine officer described to the reporter as not an assault package. It was an observation package. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance equipment. Communications gear optimized for extended loitering operations rather than rapid insertion. The MEU boarded Bataan not to storm a beach but to watch a harbor. For 12 days, from 60 miles out, with Ospreys running twice daily, that is what they did. And then Bataan came home. The harbor did not change. The Russian corvette left. The Chinese SIGINT ship completed its transit. On the surface, the strategic board looks identical to what it was before the deployment, but it is not. Every Caribbean state watching that tracking data now knows that the United States has decided to rebuild a physical presence in this region, that it will use amphibious assets as persistent intelligence platforms rather than reserving them for crisis response, and that the cost of a basing arrangement with Russia or a dual-use port deal with China includes the certainty of American surveillance aircraft overhead, American analysts logging every vessel movement, and American decision-makers with real-time situational awareness of anything that moves in or out of any harbor in the region. The board favors America in the Caribbean today.
The question that remains open, and the one that no 12-day deployment can fully answer, is whether sustained commitment follows the demonstration.
One amphib, 12 days, sends a signal.
A second fleet that routinely cycles amphibious-ready groups through Caribbean operating areas, maintains surface combatant presence in the Windward Passage, and establishes intelligence sharing arrangements with regional partners creates a posture. The difference between a signal and a posture is institutional commitment, budget allocation, and the willingness to accept that the Atlantic is a competitive theater requiring the same quality of strategic attention that the Indo-Pacific has received for the past decade. That commitment has not yet been made at the level of force structure and funding. The deployment demonstrated intent. The budget cycle will demonstrate whether that intent becomes strategy. The real audience for those 12 days was not in Havana. It was not in Moscow or Beijing, though the signals reached them clearly enough. The real audience was in the Pentagon's own force planning directorates, in the offices where decisions are made about which theater gets the next generation of assets, which fleet gets the additional surface combatants, and which region gets treated as a strategic priority rather than a strategic assumption. Bataan sat 60 miles off Cienfuegos for 12 days, and the message it carried, the one nobody wrote in a press release, was this: the Caribbean is back on the board, and the board is being watched. If the Second Fleet follows through, the geometry works in America's favor. No Caribbean island sits more than a few hundred nautical miles from the Florida Strait or the Windward Passage. Amphibious-ready groups operating from those corridors can reach any harbor on the Arc of the Antilles inside 24 hours. The Osprey's 900-kilometer combat radius, launched from a ship in international waters, covers the entire Cuban coastline from a vessel that never enters Cuban territorial waters. Chinese port infrastructure, once built, does not move. Russian corvettes, once committed to a Caribbean port call, are visible from the moment they clear the Canaries. The geography is fixed. The surveillance capability is scalable. The question is only whether the institutional will exist to sustain what 12 days off Cienfuegos demonstrated was possible. Drop a comment, yes or no, on whether the Second Fleet will actually maintain this Caribbean posture through 2027, or whether the next Indo-Pacific crisis pulls the assets east and the Caribbean goes back to being an assumption. We read every one. The Bataan came home, the Ospreys landed, the well deck drained, and 60 miles south of Cienfuegos. The harbor continued to receive whatever vessels chose to visit it, logged by satellites with orbital schedules and gaps that every naval planner on Earth has memorized. The difference now is that every decision-maker in Moscow and Beijing, and every infrastructure minister in Kingston and Georgetown and Port of Spain, has seen what a flooded well deck and a twice-daily Osprey sortie looks like from 12 days out. That image does not go away when the ship leaves. It becomes part of the calculation, permanently. For the next video in this analysis, the Fourth Fleet's Mayport-based surface combatants and the question of whether the U.S. Navy's Atlantic posture can absorb a sustained Caribbean commitment without drawing down from the European deterrent mission. That is the unresolved variable. That is where the next move on this board will be made. Subscribe, and the analysis will be here when it happens. The carrier can come home. The geography it argued for does not move.